Hello, David, and welcome to Analytics India magazine. And we're really happy to be interacting with you today.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Uh-huh. So before we go ahead with the interview itself, I mean, I'd love to know a little bit about yourself and your professional journey. I mean, you are a professor for mass communication, and you're a solid advocate for ethics of emerging technology. So a little bit about what got you started within technology, and how did you come about this field from the academia that you already pursue.
Yeah, people's trajectories are always really very interesting because where you start and where you think you're going are very different from where you end up, right? And so the practicalities of life and how your career evolves has a kind of life of its own. And I would say if you asked me 30 years ago if I thought I would be here, the answer would be no. Because 30 years ago, I was writing a dissertation on Hegel. I was interested in environmental ethics and working on the question of otherness and how we respond to the natural environment and things like this. And I was at the time, however, um, paying for the bad habit of going to school by working as a web developer. And
Mhm.
so I had some real, hands-on experience with technology, but I always thought of that as a way of paying the bills and being different from my academic career. But as I graduated, I recognized that we were on the cusp of a number of really big challenges from emerging technology. First, the internet, but then artificial intelligence, robots, you name it. And that there was a real need for, good philosophical thinking about the challenges and the opportunities that these technologies presented to us as individuals, but also as communities. And so it became very clear to me as I graduated that this really would be a place to create some opportunity for myself. And so I began to sort of position myself as a media philosopher or a technology philosopher or whatever the case is. And that opened a lot of doors, both in opportunities for teaching, but also for publishing. And that kind of led in this direction. That kind of led me to this moment in time where I'm interested in the ethics of emerging technology, specifically with regards to artificial intelligence and robots.
Right, right, David. And now, getting into the crux of this interview itself. Now, I mean, just for a conversation's sake, if we were to differentiate, AI first and then get into robots. Now, ethics in AI itself is a very big topic today, even though the whole technology is at a very nascent stage. What's your opinion? Because this conversation started a lot, many years after the development of the technology itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you can see just in so, for example, this is like the 10th anniversary of the first real big book I wrote on this subject. And 10 years ago, when I wrote that book called The Machine Question, the phrase AI ethics really hadn't been very popular. I mean, in fact, people didn't even use it. I don't even have it in the book because it was not recognized as something to talk about. Now, a decade later, that's all people want to talk about, right? It's huge, it's blown up. And I think that shows us that the understanding of the social meaning and significance and consequences of this very powerful technology has become incredibly important for us as individuals, but also for us as localized and globalized communities, trying to grapple with what this new powerful technology is doing to the world that we occupy. And I think we've come to the point where we realize that research and development that is not in touch with the social consequences and an understanding of what this is going to do for us and to us is irresponsible, and that responsible development of technology has become sort of the watchword. We want to make sure not only are we devising these brand new toys and tools and everything else, but we are thinking about what they mean for us and how they will affect us. So yeah, you're exactly right. This has exploded in interest and popularity, and for good reasons.
Mhm. But I think even when we speak about the ethics of AI, I mean it's a polarizing debate as to what it's supposed to entail and whether or not we should ponder over such a thought. While we have one side of the group that kind of agrees with everything that you just said, David, the others kind of, there is a whole bunch who kind of presume this to be a rather an obstacle to speedy evolution.
Yeah, and there's a real tension, I think, that you can see between the academic researchers and the industry. But you can also see this in the industry, right? You have people who are vocal advocates for AI ethics as a way of helping to curb the sort of capitalist accumulation of power that is happening in big tech. And then the big tech people who are like, we don't want regulation, or we want limited regulation so that we can evolve this technology and implement it in ways that we think is going to serve the public interest. And this is just good democracy, right? I mean, this kind of argument is just what happens when democratic citizens get involved in the shape and direction of their own destinies. And I think it's actually a good thing. I think it would be very bad for us if there was only one univocal answer to these questions, and if there was only one way of doing things. I think there does have to be the tension. I think the real question we have is, who has the power here to make decisions and implement these things? And I think power asymmetries are very crucial to recognize and to begin to do something about, because we're not all equal in this conversation. And I think, getting to the point where we can rely on our governments to create a more equitable exchange of ideas and concerns and interests, I think is going to be to everyone's benefit.
Right. And now when we think about, presuming that we will reach a state of, artificial general intelligence at some point, which is when the whole idea of, robots being, sentient creatures and I mean, sentient, I'm not sure what to call them, creatures, devices, thing. I'm not sure what will be their pronoun at that point, but I mean, that is when we would have to think about something like a robot rights, laws, and governance. But given the state at which things are, I think what we have today are the industrial robots or something like an Alexa or a Siri. But I mean, how would you even define a robot at this point?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And it's a question that doesn't have a very direct and easy answer, right? So, unlike artificial intelligence, which is the product of an academic conference in the mid 1950s, the word robot actually is the product of science fiction. It comes to us from Karl Čapek, who wrote a play in 1920 called RUR. And he used the word robot, which is derived from a Czech word meaning servant or slave, robota, to name these artificial servants that were the sort of center of his narrative about the struggle between the human population and their servants, these robots. And since this time, you can see robots have infiltrated our science fiction. They're all over the place, from Star Trek to Star Wars to Westworld. I mean, you name it, we see robots everywhere. And that means that for a lot of people, what we recognize as a robot and how we understand robot really comes to us out of fiction and not out of science fact. And there's a word for this. It's called science fiction prototyping. Now, science fiction prototyping has advantages and disadvantages. The main advantage to science fiction prototyping is it helps non-experts understand what is in play, understand what this technology might mean, and how they can really grapple with some of the big questions that are necessary to ask and resolve. But it does mean that engineers and AI scientists and roboticists are constantly struggling against expectations that are fictional expectations that don't measure up to the real world development and research that is being done in the field of robotics. So there's a kind of double-edged sword here. What it gives, it also takes away, but it's useful, right? Now, one of the most widely recognized definitions of what a robot is comes from a guy named George Becky, who says a robot is a device that senses, thinks, and acts. Now, Becky says, I recognize this is a rather broad definition, and in fact, it is almost too broad, because lots of technologies then would be considered robots. Think, for example, of a thermostat. A thermostat senses, right? It has a temperature gauge. It has the ability to think by comparing or process by comparing the existing temperature to a preset. And it acts, right? If the temperature is too low, it turns on the heat. If the temperature is too high, it turns on the air conditioning. So under that classification or that characterization that Becky gives, a thermostat would be a robot. And for a lot of people, that seems like a very weird way of designating what your thermostat is. No one talks about the robot on the wall, right? It's a thermostat. All of this is just simply to say that the word robot and its definition is complicated. It is something that is as much an invention of fiction as it is of actual research and development efforts in science and engineering practice. And its definition and characterization is contentious, even among experts in the field. And we can expect that the term is going to evolve and change as the contexts change, as our experience with the technology changes, and as the technology becomes integrated into various aspects of our world and our lives. So for me, I look at it as a kind of general umbrella term, which depending on context can encompass a wide range of different technological objects and devices, including artificial intelligence, algorithms, androids, automation, etc. So it's one of those terms that is pregnant with ambiguity, but I think that offers us the opportunity to get more specific and to talk about things in a much more context situated form where each time we use the word, we're very clear how we're defining it, how we're operationalizing it, and how we're using this terminology.
Right. Hi, David. And going by, the thermostat example itself per se, like now, even if we were to deem thermostat as a robot, there are rules and regulations in place to ensure that the thermostat is built certain ways, it performs certain ways. There are, quality metrics, there are laws and regulations to producing, using, and manufacturing it. Now, when we think about robots, that would also entail another whole portion of perhaps rights and citizenship and whatnot. I mean, what kind of robots are we talking about then, and why are these two any different?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think we need to be specific about two things simultaneously. We need, in all these conversations, to talk about robots as very specific kinds of implementations. Using it in the abstract, I think, creates confusion, because then we don't know whether we're talking about thermostats, smartphones, or a social robot that is being used to help care for elderly in the nursing facility, right? But I also think we need to be very specific about rights, because rights is also an ambiguous term. That means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so the more specific we can get in these conversations, the better chance we have of ensuring that we're actually talking about the same thing, that we're actually debating something of substance and not merely mistaking terminological differences for differences in the content of what is being described and discussed. So I think anytime we get into the subject matter, it is really important, especially because the two terms that are thrown around in the conversation, the word robot and the word rights, and the word ethics for that matter, are words that are very powerful, very important, but also rather abstract in this sort of theoretical sense. And the more specificity that we can bring to the conversation, the better chance we have of really getting into this in a way that does resolve the big questions.
Mhm. Right. And as per, going back to what I was trying to understand here, David, what kind of robots should deserve what kind of rights, and what kind of ethics are we exactly talking about? I mean,
Yeah.
what's the whole debate about? Because, like you said, people are just throwing terms. Like I've written about ethics for quite some time, and I can see that it's just terminologies, and people are going by their own kind of definition. It doesn't have to translate to anything meaningful by the end of the conversation.
Right. Yeah. No, this is a constant struggle, but it's an important struggle, because it does mean that people bring to this their own experiences and their own background. And I think the more interdisciplinary conversation we have about this, the better results we get. But interdisciplinarity also brings with it differences in terminology. And that is something that has to be always negotiated, case by case basis. But you asked the question, what kind of robots, what kind of rights? And I think this is where getting specific can be really useful. So let's get specific in a very concrete way by looking at an example where right now robots have been granted rights. So this is not a science fiction thing. This is not a future, it's coming down the road. There's actual situations right now here in, our world where robots have been granted some legal protections. And that's with personal delivery robots. So in November of 2020, the legislature of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania passed a law that classifies autonomous delivery robots, or what the law calls personal delivery devices, as pedestrians. And they did this in order to provide a legal framework for the deployment of these devices on the city streets and the sidewalks. Similar laws have been passed in a number of other jurisdictions in the US, including the Commonwealth of Virginia, which provides the following stipulation. I'm just going to read this to you because it's really a very succinct format. A personal delivery device operating on a sidewalk or crosswalk shall have all the rights and responsibilities applicable to a pedestrian under the same circumstances. So in these states, these personal delivery robots, a class of robot that is increasingly being seen in all kinds of places, are granted the same rights and responsibilities that already belong to human pedestrians. But, and this is the important point, in granting this particular status and the rights and responsibilities that go with it to the personal delivery robot, the state is not seeking to resolve and address the big questions of robot moral standing or robot AI personhood. All they're doing is simply trying to provide a legal framework for integrating these particular devices on our city streets and to align that integration with existing legal practices. So this is what the robot invasion looks like. It doesn't take place as it's looking in science fiction with, the robots revolting against their human masters and attacking us and rising up in revolution. It's a story that's been told since Chopik's 1920 stage play, and it gets a lot of traction in our science fiction. But the actual invasion, the actual robot uprising, if we even want to use that term, is going to take place in ways that are much more mundane, as state legislatures and courts need to resolve questions deciding how we integrate these socially interactive and smart or intelligent systems into our existing moral and legal structures. So in the end, it looks less like Terminator. It looks more like a very boring episode of Law and Order.
Right, David. And I mean, just out of curiosity, or just so that I understand it right now, given the right ground, say a pedestrian, say another being, say runs over such a delivery robot, he or she would be penalized in the court of law, and they would be liable to some kind of punishment.
They would be liable probably for damages. So what the states are trying to do is figure out, in the case of an accident, how damages will be awarded and who will be the responsible party for the accident. So obviously, if you hit a human being, it's more than just paying the hospital bill. There may be some criminal aspect to it.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's going to happen in the case of personal delivery robots. It may just be a matter of a fine or damages. But these laws are so brand new that none of them have been challenged in courts. So we don't know how a court will interpret these laws, but the laws do exist, and they will inevitably be used at some point by someone to mitigate an accident and figure out how responsibility and accountability are assigned for the damages that are produced in the case of the accident.
Right. But, this is just perhaps a very initial step. And even the kind of robots that we are talking about here, they are more of, they do, say, repetitive tasks. It's supposed to deliver something from point A to point B. That's all it knows. That's all it does. Now, as things become more intelligent, how do you, and it does a lot more, it's a lot more interactive, a lot more conversational. Say even it can display, human-like emotions at some other point. What should be the ideal scenario then?
So this, I think, is an important question, but it's a question for the future technology, right? It's not a question that is, coming at us currently, because our technology are nowhere near achieving those capabilities. But I don't think it's too soon to start asking these questions, both as a moral matter, but also as a legal matter. Because I think, recognizing that if we do in fact create these technologies that have these greater capabilities, we are going to have to decide whether they are subjects of law, like another person, or whether they're just tools and instruments and things. The really interesting thing in legal practice is that we really work with a binary structure. We have two categories. Entities are either persons or things. And you can see how we've organized our world to take various objects and various entities and fit them in one category or the other. So, for example, your lawnmower is a thing. It's never going to be a person, right? However, a corporation is a person. And it's not a person because it has emotions and feelings and thoughts. It's a person because we need a way to allow for the corporation to engage us in social practices, like entering contracts and creating relationships in business. And how the law responds to this is by struggling through not only the legislative process, but also through the challenges in courts. And you can see already how with these initial laws for personal delivery robots, we are evolving in the direction of having that transpire with these devices. And so as the technology gets more sophisticated, as it becomes more capable, the line that divides the thing from the person might need to be crossed. When that happens and why it happens is going to be very particular to the circumstance, and it may be different in one jurisdiction as opposed to another jurisdiction. But it is something that we're going to have to look at and get into. Just to give you another good example of where this is already occurring, Ryan Abbott, who has the Artificial Inventor Project, has been petitioning courts all over the world to try and get a artificial intelligence program called DABUS recognized as an inventor on a patent application. In some jurisdictions, like the EU and like the UK and the US, the application has been denied, but not because the artificial intelligence is not seen as an inventor, but because of the way inventor is defined in the current law. In other jurisdictions, Australia and South Africa, where the law is characterized differently, he's been successful. And the artificial intelligence now is recognized as the sole inventor of a new product. And so you can see how this is not just about the technology, it's about our human laws and our human social structures. And reconciling these two things is really where the struggle is. And it's where a lot of these questions bubble to the surface. And it's where we need, I think, to be very attentive to what these new challenges are and what new opportunities or problems they're going to make for us as we move forward.
I think the patent example is a pretty good one, because say now even in countries like in places like Australia or South Africa, say somebody wants to challenge this patent, or say they would want to go against the patent holder. I mean, how would that pan out? I don't think they would bring an AI system into the court of law. I mean, that's where I think the definition of the inventor, what EU and US is saying, that's where that matters. Like, you can punish a person and you can hold them liable, but how can you hold a software at the end of the day? That's all it is. How can you hold that liable for anything? And at worst, what's going to happen? Shut it down?
So right now we have something called algorithmic destruction. When an algorithm behaves so poorly and it pumps out biased results or prejudicial decisions, a court can order a company to destroy the algorithm. So, I mean, it's not capital punishment, but it's a kind of punishment, right? Because not only does the company lose its investment in that development of that product, but the product itself cannot ever be used again. And so we're already seeing some evolution in that direction with the way the law is having to learn how to contend with this. The problem is that the technology is advancing at light speed, but the legal structures are advancing at pen and paper speed. And so we're always trying to catch up to these innovations well beyond, where our legal structures currently reside, and trying to fit the technology to existing laws and practices is turning out to be a significant challenge.
And in light of your experience or your discussion with, per se, lawmakers or the folks from the industry, what are some of their fundamental challenges? Like, I mean, India in itself, though we are moving quickly in terms of AI, that's kind of stuck to the enterprise level. If I were to go to, say, a civil lawyer, or anybody in any criminal lawyer, and I approach him with a case related to AI, I'm not sure what response I'm going to get. So what's the
Yeah,
scene?
no, it's a good question. And I think Ryan Abbott's experience with this is pretty indicative of how things may transpire, because the inventor of DABUS is represented by the legal team that is headed up by Ryan Abbott and his colleagues. And so, the same way in which a corporation hires lawyers to represent its interests before the court, it is possible that the AI, the enterprise that owns the AI or develops the AI, would need to have representation for its product in the court of law so that the case for it can be made. We can already see how this is happening in other areas of sort of the representation of others in both moral practice and law. So, for example, in Ecuador, when they revised their constitution, they gave the entire ecosystem of Ecuador the rights of a person. And they granted the ability of any individual in Ecuador to bring suit on behalf of the environment. And so you are always recognizing in these kinds of gestures the designation of stewards, or somebody who is in charge of representing the interests of the object or the artifact in the legal system. And we do this already in corporate law. We do it in environmental law. It's just a matter of moving this over into AI, and that's already happening in some of the representations that we see with Ryan Abbott and others.
Right. And I think this kind of clears a lot of misconception that even I presumably had about the kind of rights we are talking about when it comes to robots. Now, these are essentially different kind of rights. It's not like the basic rights that I have as a citizen of a country or as a human being. I'm not sure that we are talking about the same kind of rights for robots, are we?
Right. So remember when I said we had two ambiguous terms that we have to get more specific about? One is robot, the other one is rights.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that happens a lot in this debate is that when people hear the word rights, their mind immediately goes to human rights. And there's good reason for this. It's because human rights is something that is, for a lot of people, very powerful and very important. And when they hear the word rights, they recognize human rights as being probably the pinnacle of what we understand by rights. So this immediate association of rights with human rights is something that is understandable and expedient. It's understandable to the extent that so much of the interest circulating around this subject matter is presented and discussed in terms of human rights. And if you look at the way that the popular press has really talked about these problems, it's always in terms of, do robots have human rights? Are all robots created equal? I mean, you see all these headlines, right? And that's because it's a very powerful way to think about this question. And it really taps into people's imaginations. At the same time, it's expedient because when you do this, you can really sell content. I mean, because it pushes a lot of buttons. And so it's a really clever way to rhetorically position something. And both sides in the debate use this. I mean, it's not like one side is less prone to this than the other. Both of them, whether you're pro or con in this idea, you're using this as a lever to do sort of your argumentative work for you. But I think all of this is an error. I think all of this is mistaken. And that's because the set of possible rights belonging to one category of entity, like a human being, are very different from the set of rights that will be attributable to an artifact, like a robot or an AI. So rights does not automatically and exclusively mean human rights. Whatever rights the robot might have, that will be one set of powers, claims, privileges, and immunities, as Wesley Hofeld called them. And there may be some overlap, but they will be very different from what we recognize as the grouping or bundle of rights that fall under the category of human rights. So simply put, only human beings can have human rights. Robots will have robot rights. And what those are or what those will be, yes, we have yet to decide those things, but they're going to be different. And I think the difference is important, and we need to focus on what that difference is.
Right, David. And more on that, I mean, yeah, there was an interesting thought by, a researcher who, I mean, for reasons I cannot name, that when at the time of the conversation, it went something like, say there are sentient robots who are capable of doing XYZ things, feel anger, feel certain things. Instead of advocating for its right at a later stage, knowing fully well that a certain human ability that we're trying to embed into it is potentially dangerous, should we be creating it in the first place?
I think this is a reasonable question. I mean, I think one of the things we have to ask ourselves is if indeed we create these things. This is Frankenstein's problem, Dr. Frankenstein in the novel Frankenstein, right? He creates the monster and then can't take responsibility for what he's created, right? He runs away and the monster has to pursue him all the way to the North Pole to try to get recognition from his creator. And I think one of the lessons of the Frankenstein novel is that there needs to be some forethought and some deep thinking about what it is we do create, because once we do create it, we are responsible for it. And we need to answer for it and be accountable for what it does or doesn't do. Now, does that mean that we curb research and development? Not necessarily, but it does mean that I think people involved in research and development have got to, in advance, address some of these questions which they think come later in the game. I think they're already necessary to address at the beginning of the development process, so that we know what it is we're creating, why it is we're creating it, and what responsibilities fall on our shoulders as a responsibility of producing these kinds of things.
Right, right. But is it the job of a technologist to begin with, David? Because these are not something that we can compute. Like emotion is not something that I can, probably a data scientist and can represent in one's nose. Not something that that you can have an algorithm for. I mean, you can mimic what we feed, but to have it, to be able to create it on your own is a different ball game altogether.
Correct. And I think this shows us a difference between what happens on the design side and what happens on the reception side. So designers of these systems build them with whatever capabilities they think they are able to devise and develop. But once these things get out into the wild and people begin to interact with them, we find different questions arising that maybe were never even thought of at the time of the development and design of the device. A really good example of this, I think, comes from Google's Lambda, which recently Blake Lemoine has said is sentient, right? Obviously, Google was just creating a large language model that spits out text like a chatbot. But in his interactions with it, Lemoine found it to possess things that he took to mean sentience, that he took to mean consciousness. Now, he's not necessarily wrong, but it is a different way of looking at what is going on here. The designers may not have intended it, but the recipient and user experienced it. And so, like with anthropomorphism, you can't just get rid of it. You can't just say, stop doing that. We do it. And the fact that we do it is something that we need to really begin to take seriously, because even the best designs, once they hit the street, something unexpected and unintended may happen. The science fiction author William Gibson has a really good line in his cyberpunk series where he says the street finds its own use for things the designer never realized or intended. And I think we have to recognize that in this case, the street does have its own use for things, and that we need to take that usage very seriously. And user side things are as important as design side things.
Mhm. Right, right, David. But then again, going back, to what you said. Now, the Google representative kind of, in his own way, thought the program was sentient and conscious, but that was that person's definition of that was based on his definition. And
Right.
again, everything goes back to definitions. Ethics is a very different thing to different people. Consciousness means different things to different people. An AI with a personality could mean different things to different people. How can we expect, such a non-universal thing or such a subjective thing to ever be quantified or be put across in computers and in a very realistic sense?
So you can see there's really two ways to come at this. One way is sort of top down, authoritarian, thou shalt not do these things, right? These kinds of very strict, you won't do this, we won't build this, you shouldn't do this. The other way is bottom up in a much more democratic way. And I think for my understanding of this, I think the democratic way is probably more robust long term. Totalitarianism and authoritarianism doesn't have a long shelf life, and it doesn't really work well on a large scale with regards to these technologies. So I think what we're seeing play out in real time right now is a conversation, a debate, and a dialogue about how we make sense of this stuff. So yeah, this Google engineer got all this press and all this attention because he put it out there in the world. But you can see already immediately people responded. People answered this, and they had their own insights and their own way of contextualizing it. And they published stories in newspapers and magazines and academic venues. And I think this is how this process needs to evolve. These things are so new. What they mean is so open to interpretation that a robust and informed dialogue about it is the only way we're going to evolve in the direction of some consensus. And that's not going to come immediately. And there's going to be false starts, there's going to be mistakes made. But I think the important thing is that we join the conversation and that we allow for diversity in the conversation. I think if we only hear from the engineers, we will only get one version of this. If we only hear from people out of a Western European tradition, we'll only get one way of thinking about these things. I think we're talking about global technology here, and we need to draw on the global strength of us together to sort of bring into this conversation different ways of approaching these questions and these problems.
Right, David, right. But, in there itself lies another problem. Like you said, mistakes will be made. Now, given that it is a global technology, like, perhaps what, an OpenAI did with DALI or DALI 2, when they released it to a very small set of people to get feedback, to kind of improve on things. But that small set does not represent the world. Now, with the same thing, if such technologies are out there, and I think a lot of people are in the dilemma. Even if you leave it in the open source manner, or you kind of let the whole world access it, thing can go wrong. If you keep it with a small focus group, even then things can go wrong, because inputs will be from very small set of people compared to the billion population.
Yeah, this is a problem with the way the technology is concentrated in various power centers, right? The technology is being developed by these large tech industries like Google, like DeepMind, like Microsoft. Those industries are primarily located in the global north. And that means that we have these asymmetries of power when you look at how this is distributed globally. And as a result of that, there is a concern, and I think it's a very important concern, that the development of this technology is going to reproduce traditional forms of exclusion, imperialism, and colonialism, and that decolonizing AI has become a term that you hear now as a way of trying to bring much more diversity into play as these technologies are both developed, but also as they are implemented and utilized. And I don't know that we have a really good model for this. I think we see some direction being formulated both politically, but also technologically, with regards to how these things are brought out and developed and utilized. But I think, again, we are only learning right now how to do this in a way that is going to be sustainable and that's going to be robust enough to get us the kind of insight and the kind of data that's going to be necessary to integrate these things in a way that is in our interest, which is clearly what this is all about.
Right, right. And, given your experience within this field itself, I kind of have this question for everyone I interview. Like a lot of these things kind of is bound to happen when and if we reach the state of, AGI or, something more superior than that. And even there are the two corners. Some say that we can achieve it in the next 5 to 10 years, and the others say probably not even in our lifetime. Where do you stand on the current technological scenario?
So I think the AGI scenario, although very attractive and very thought-provoking, I think it's kind of a distraction because it allows us to postpone, right? Whether you're for this stuff or against this stuff, it allows you to say, well, we don't have that technology yet, so we don't need to worry about this. We got more immediate things that we got to concern ourselves with, and we just don't need to think about these problems. We can just leave them for the future. And I think that means that we miss opportunities to get out in front of this. We miss opportunities to begin developing the frameworks and the methodologies that are necessary for us to do the kind of work that is going to be necessary if and when this might happen. So I, in my own work, don't like to talk about AGI. I like to talk about the technology we have right here, right now, and the pressures that it puts on human populations and human individuals as we try to grapple with what these things mean in our world. And I think if we're able to do that, if we're able to do it with this very rudimentary versions of AI that we have currently, we will be better prepared for the moment if and when the AGI is ever able to be real. And I think by postponing the decision making, we're fooling ourselves. We're saying, don't worry about it. Everything's fine. We kind of did this with climate change, right? We said, "Oh, climate change," right? Back in the middle of the 20th century, people were already saying climate change is going to be an issue. We should start thinking about it. And people are like, it's a future problem. Don't worry about it. Well, we're in that future, and because we didn't take it seriously 75 years ago, we aren't ready to respond to it in a way that's going to be very effective. And we're trying to catch up in a very short period of time. I don't want the same thing to happen with other challenges. And I think AGI is one of those challenges. We don't need it before we start to ask these questions. We can ask those questions now.
Mhm. Another question that I did have around perhaps the same subject, but at a more philosophical level. Now, a lot of human beings barely understand themselves, from a biological perspective or from, the way our mind works. And now we are trying to achieve something that is very Hollywoodish or Hollywood inspired into a machine. Now, is that the right approach? I mean, should we be chasing, some machine that can feel our emotions when we barely understand ourselves?
Yeah, so two things I'd say in response to this. Number one, I think one of the mistaken goals of this entire enterprise from the time of the Dartmouth Conference in 1954 was to try to reproduce human intelligence in a machine. We can already reproduce human intelligence. We call that children. We don't need more human intelligence. We have plenty. What we need is alien intelligence. We need the intelligence of something other that does things we can't do. A good example are dogs. Domesticated dogs are really important to us as human beings. Why? Because they don't think the way we do. They don't sense the world the way we do. They do things differently. And difference, I think, is really crucial here. I think we should look at AI as alien intelligence. We're creating something that is non-human, and that's actually important. And so I go back to this thing I said earlier, difference matters. We're not trying to create similitude. We're trying to create something something different that will make a difference for us. The second thing I would say is the way in which AI is able to emulate humans is considered to be, an issue, right? Can a chatbot fool you into thinking you're talking to a human being when you're just talking to a chatbot? This is Alan Turing's original definition of machine intelligence, right? He says, we can't define intelligence. We don't know what it is. So I'll create this game, the game of imitation. If a machine can pretend well enough that it's a human conversational partner, then we must think it's intelligent. I would think that it would be very crucial for us to focus on what's going on in Alan Turing's original posing of this problem. Turing jumps very quickly from communication to intelligence. That communication is a sign of intelligence. We now have machines that can communicate, but aren't necessarily intelligent. And I think if we focus on the phenomena, the social phenomena of communication, and don't necessarily tie it to an intellectualization process, and that words can be exchanged in ways that are very ritualistic, that create our social fabric, that we can understand what these machines are doing with us when they use language. They're not expressing themselves the way that we think about it, but they are using language that is creating meaning for us. And I think focusing on communication as opposed to intelligence is actually a really interesting way to reformulate Turing's original game of imitation and what it can do for us and what it means for us.
And, at the end of all of this, given how much and the kind of progress that you have seen, what's your prediction as to what's going to happen next? What do you hope to happen next? You did tell me that, that was a very interesting point that you made, that, probably robot invasion is not something like the Terminator. It's going to be a very boring one wherein they'll be taking over mundane tasks. Now, much similar to that, what are your anticipation for the near future as well as the long term?
So I think in the near term, we are going to see a kind of robot invasion that's going to take place like the fall of Rome. These machines are going to come into our world like the barbarians did in ancient Rome, occupy various important places in our social fabric by making decisions about loan applications, by making decisions about government services, by making decisions about who gets hired, who doesn't get hired, etc. And one day we're all going to wake up and say, where did all the robots come from? Now, they won't be embodied robots necessarily, right? There'll be automated systems in the cloud and elsewhere. But I think, we need to be prepared for that question. We don't want to be surprised. We want to recognize that we are the ones that make the decisions about how these are integrated into our world. We are the ones who decide when and if to use a particular algorithm to make decisions with regards to human populations or what is capable of being done either in government or in business. And instead of just following the kind of technological imperative, which says we got new technology, you got to use it, I think we have to be critical. We have to ask ourselves, just because we got it doesn't mean we have to use it, and doesn't mean we have to use it in this exact way. So I think a great deal of critical thinking is very necessary right now. And that's hard because I think a lot of the understanding of the technology is situated in silos. So only computer scientists know what's going on, or only AI scientists know what's going on. I don't think your artists know the way that AI is changing the art world necessarily. I don't think that journalists know the way that AI is affecting how news is produced and consumed in the field of algorithmic content generation. I don't think that people involved in physics understand the way in which new scientific discoveries are being made by algorithms without human involvement. And I think the more we can educate broadly in all fields, in understanding of this technology and its importance to us, but also its dangers, the better off we are going to be with regards to this interdisciplinary conversation we need to have about the integration of these things into our world. So that's short term. And I think it's really the onus is on us as educators, and it's really for us to bring people up to speed so that they feel confident. I tell my students this all the time. I said, if you approach your technology as magic, and you do, right? We look at this thing as a magical tool. We type an incantation like Harry Potter and boom, something amazing happens. And we're really awed by what it does. I think if you treat your technology like magic, it's in control. What we have to do is demystify it. And we have to demystify it for non-experts. And that is what educators are all about. Our job is to demystify the technology and make it resonate for every field of human interaction. Long term, I think we need to begin to develop the legal and philosophical structures for contextualizing these technologies on the broad scale. What do these things mean for human individuals, but also for human communities? What is the destiny of the human species when it is this involved with its technological objects? Now, this is not new. The Greeks already had this question with writing, right? In the Phaedrus, Socrates worries that writing is going to ruin human civilization. Well, it didn't happen, but it was a good question to ask. And I think we can learn from history, looking at how other technologies have been dealt with in the past, but also recognizing what makes this new technology unique, what makes it new, and what new challenges it brings into that conversation. But I think it is a rather speculative and rather heady conversation, but it is nevertheless as important as the more practical things that we have to do.